Hi everyone. I thought it'd be interesting, since it's Dawsember, to do a little video on my Thing client. It's not usually what I do, but been having fun watching some of these videos, and so I thought, hey, maybe I'll give it a try. And I wanted to try to put DOS 6.2.2 on this thing for a while. Um, so I spent some time, quite a bit of time actually, putting together a little bit of a guide since it's kind of convoluted. Getting DOS 6.2.2 loaded on something without a floppy drive, if you don't have a floppy drive, if you're just trying to do it with a USB floppy less solution. So here we go. Let's try this out. So we should start first by why I want to put DOS 6.2.2 on my Thing client. When I bought this thing, it was primarily because I needed something that was cheap. I think I paid maybe $15 for it without a power supply off eBay. That made the purchase decision very simple. Second, I needed something with a real parallel port and a real serial port. It also has those things, which makes it nice for doing some retro projects where you need access to a 16-bit DOS environment and a serial port or a parallel port. It also plays a lot of classic games relatively well, even on FreeDOS, which is what I had on it initially. There's a couple of complications with FreeDOS. For one, you cannot run Windows 3.11 on FreeDOS trivially. And I'm also aware that there is a version of DOS out there that is basically Windows 95's DOS, but then it's patched to have all of the original DOS commands. And it's rolled up into a nice CD-ROM installer, and I've tried it, and it does work. But what if you want actual DOS? There's a lot of things that actual DOS still does better than FreeDOS. So that's the why of it. Now we should get on to the complications caused by trying to do this type of install with USB only. Full disclosure, I do not have a USB floppy drive. It seems kind of silly to me. Maybe after the fact, I probably should invest in one. But what I have right now in large supply are USB thumb drives. So I thought it would be great to install DOS 6.2.2 on a USB thumb drive. I have a large background in making install media for DOS 6.2.2. That was a large part of my internship. When I first graduated from trade school, I made Ghost setup, modern Ghost setup, well, modern at the time. I mean, I think it was maybe 2003, for installing Windows 95 DOS, Windows 3.1 in a university setting. That was my internship. It was a large part of my project, so I thought this would be absolutely no problem. Boy, was I wrong. For number one, we were using Ghost to deploy the operating system. That means essentially you had an installed work environment. I had floppy drives still. It was 2003. They were still on pretty much every machine at that point. All I have now are images of those disks. And it's somewhere I have the actual disks, but they're packed. And even if I did have access to them, physical access to them, I would need a floppy drive that I could plug into my Thing client. I don't have that. So I thought, no problem. I'll just figure it out. Boy, was I wrong. It is a rabbit hole. If you've ever Googled how to do this with just a CD, it's absolutely frustrating. There's tons of misinformation, people who don't really understand what you're talking about, and that's the largest problem. So, some people think, yeah, it's trivial. You just take a boot disk and you make it. Well, there's a couple of complications, the first of which, if you put a boot disk onto a USB drive and you stick it into your Thing client, when it boots up, the way that the drives are laid out, fdisk will not have access to activating any new partition you make. And that's due to a limitation in the DOS 6.22 fdisk. So that aside, doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of problems. There's also issues with the installer not wanting to install. If you have the A drive booting up on that USB stick, and even if you do manage to boot up the A drive, when you go to try to switch the disks, it doesn't work. So we're stuck with not being able to actually create a DOS install. What does that mean? Well, the answer is really simple. You don't install DOS onto a thin client. You install DOS onto a virtual machine and then migrate your install to the thin client, just like a Ghost install. Basically, we're installing the operating system on a platform that's similar. We are creating install media from that, which is essentially just copying the files from one system to the other. It's still not trivial, but I think I've laid it out in a way that makes at least logical sense. Okay, so we're here on the Windows PC. First thing we're going to do is we are going to put in our USB drive, thumbstick. You want to have at least a 2 gig. Well, I mean, you could go with a lot smaller, but the maximum available usable size on a USB drive is 2 gigs under DOS. So we want to set it up so that DOS can only see a 2 gig partition. And it's also good if you don't try to split it up into larger or smaller partitions. You want to just have one 2 gig partition on the USB stick. So the fastest way I know to do it, what has worked well for me, is this little utility called DiskPart. So we load that up, and this is DiskPart, and basically it's a scripting tool, but it lets you partition disks. You can get access to learning about the commands by typing help. Not really important, because really all we're going to do here is we're going to list the disks, and that shows us that we've got 1 terabyte hard drive. That's obviously the hard drive on the computer, and my 8 gig thumb drive. So I'm going to select disk 1, and then I'm going to list the partitions. There's already a 2 gig partition on there, but I'll clean the drive as if I'm going to set it up anyway. Sometimes you get an error, but it usually is fine. You can tell now there's no partitions on there. You just do create part, primary, size equals 2000. That's 2000 megabytes, and that creates the partition. The next thing you want to do is just do active to make that partition active. I don't know if that makes a difference on a USB stick, specifically if we're going to do floppy disk emulation, and we are going to eventually, but I do it anyway. There is also a method of formatting the disk from within this tool, but for our purposes I'm just going to show you the easiest way is to go find your drive and then just do format, and you'll see now it's going to allow us to format it in FAT16, FAT32, and extended FAT and NTFS, but we want FAT because that's FAT16. That's what DOS can see. Don't mess around with the allocation units, and then just change it to whatever you want to call it. We'll just do 2 gig. And it's going to warn us that it's going to erase everything even though it's already erased. And now the stick is prepared. So then the next thing you want to do is you want to go into VM VirtualBox, and I'm going to be posting links for everything in the description. So it'll boot up more or less like this, and you're going to go new. Type in the name of the operating system. If it doesn't automatically populate, you can just go to other and then DOS to set the system up. It'll ask you how much memory you want. 32 megs is more than enough. Next, create a virtual hard disk now. Click create, and then next, and then I usually just do a fixed size disk. You could probably do dynamically allocated if you're feeling lazy. I do fixed size. And then I only need 50 megs. That's way more than I need. The thin client, I think, only has a 60 meg storage flash media on it. That doesn't really matter. The next important thing we need to do is go in here. Once it's created, enable the USB. I just use HxC. It's probably slower than HxC, but I've had problems with that in the past. You click OK, and then once you're in here, you can hit this little plus here. You want to select your drive. If you don't do that, the emulator is not going to see it even when we configure it to work. Yes, I know that's USB. Yes, I know we're installing DOS. It'll all be clear in a minute. Okay, so next we're going to start the machine up by double clicking, and then we are going to get this error saying it needs a startup disk. You can just go ahead and click cancel, and then you want to choose disk image, and then at this point you will navigate to the location on your computer where you've stored your DOS 622 installation floppies. I can't tell you where to find them, but I mean, they're not that hard to find. And absolutely don't do this unless you have a license. There's my little disclaimer section. So I've got them under floppy disks, and then you just pick disk 1 and tell the machine to reset, and it's going to reboot. And now we're in the DOS installer. You just hit enter and tell it to configure, and it's going to reboot again. Just formatted the hard drive, a fake hard drive that we set up. Press enter for DOS, and then we'll get to, now we need to change the disk, so we'll choose disk image. We're going to put in disk 2 and press enter, and then we're going to change the disk image again, disk 3, press enter. It is really that simple. So then it tells us to remove the disk. We go down here again, and we're going to right click and remove disk from virtual drive, and press enter, and press enter again. It will restart, and that's installing DOS. So then if you want, you can go ahead and install Windows at this point, just to make it a little easier. on the other end. So you put the disk A in, go to A for disk 1 and set up. Make all modifications for you. It's usually pretty safe, and we're going to overwrite it anyway. Okay, and there we go. That is setting up Windows. And then we press Enter to exit setup, and it says it's not set up correctly, and I don't know why, but it always does that. But everything is perfectly fine. I'm not going to start Windows to show you it works in the virtual machine because I think that will actually create a swap file. It may have already done that. But the important takeaway here is now we've got everything installed we are going to need to make this work. So the next thing we're going to do is I have created a whole bunch of automation to make this go easier. And that'll all be up on my GitHub. You just select this image, Thin DOS USB support for VM, and click OK. And then you can switch to A. There's the disk. Copy everything that's here. C. And then just choose to overwrite. So now that that's copied, when we reboot the machine, we should be able to mount the USB stick on the host computer. Oops. Of course, it's good to not have the disk in there. There we go. I don't know why that reboots. Maybe someone at Oracle knows why that reboots. Okay. So then the third option is the one you want to use when you're in your VM. And it initializes the ASPI manager for USB mass storage, which, as you can see, detects the USB stick. And if we switch to drive D, there it is. You can see the label that we made. So next step is to go to drive C and then use xcopy /s, which copies everything recursively all through the subdirectories, and then we do C/ and D, and it is going to copy everything. So then we can just go to D and verify that all the files are there. I usually at this point delete command com and delete the two files that Windows made. And that's pretty much it. I mean, you can close out your DOS machine because you're pretty much done at that point. So then next, and you can see we've got everything, all the files are on there. And we can shut this down and move this over here for a minute, because now we're gonna copy some files over to the 2 gig partition while I remember to do it. So then you can just take these files here, and replace the files at the destination. Those will, and particularly the autoexec bat and configsys, will help you set up your hard drive to recognize the USB stick once everything's done. So that's helpful. But I always forget to do this part, so I wanted to do that first. So that's done. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go and take another emulator, and we're going to do HxC's Floppy Emulator DOS Disk Browser. And we are going to create a DOS boot disk. So you can go and find a DOS boot disk somewhere on the internet. Google is a great thing. So what I did is, again, it's stored on my desktop in my floppy disks directory, and then you just put DOS 622 IMA. You don't really need all of this stuff, so you can delete quite a bit of it. I usually leave the mouse stuff, but I get rid of the CD stuff because I'm not going to use it. You're just trying to make enough space for the rest of the files. You're going to want Xcopy. Like I said, the version of fdisk that's on here is not compatible with what we're trying to do, so we have to replace it with something else. So I like to just remove it, and you just click delete, and that gets rid of those files, and then you're left with 214K. It doesn't seem like a lot of space, but it's more than we need. So then you go back to our little thin DOS. So we can take these files here, which are all the files that we need to facilitate preparing the disk and copying the files over. If you find a boot disk and it does not have Xcopy and format on it, you'll have to go into your thumb drive that you created and in the DOS directory, copy those files along with EMM386 and command com in order to, or EMM386 and HIMEM, in order to prepare the drive correctly. Plus, it's nice to have those mouse files for later. It's also nice to have a copy of edit. This particular boot disk messed with the configuration of edit, so I delete the INI file because it annoys me. And I've copied over a new autoexec and configsys for automation purposes, and then you just do save and export. And the important bit here, the takeaway, is you've got to select IMG first, and then know where you're saving it. You're gonna have to remember for later because you'll come back when you're making the USB drive bootable. So then you click Save. And I already made this before, so I'm going to replace it. And then that's pretty much done, so you can close out of that. Next thing you're going to want to do is load up the Universal Netboot installer, which is this neat little tool that lets you take a floppy disk image by selecting floppy, also ISOs. Although I have other tools that work a lot better for ISOs. This one works really great for just putting a floppy onto a USB drive. Then you go to your directory and there it is. Pick your boot image. Remember not to use the VM image that comes with the distribution. You want the one you made. Click Open. And then click OK. And then click Exit. And at that point, you're done and ready to go. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is remove any USB devices that you have, particularly mass storage devices. It's probably okay to leave USB keyboard and mouse. And even if you do have issues, you can disable those the device drivers from trying to reset them. And I linked documentation for those drivers in the configuration files if you'd like to see. But basically we're just going to pull out my internal USB stick here so that we can move on to the next step, which is installing the operating system. Alright, so we're going to put the USB stick into the thin client and we are going to turn the thin client on. You're going to want to make sure that you've configured your thin client to boot from USB, that you have no USB drives installed, because that will cause an issue where it won't know which one to boot from. Then once you get to our automation menu, you're going to want to pick Prepare Disk, which is option 1, and it will load just high memory, which you won't even really need, but we're going to go ahead and go into fdisk from FreeDOS, which I've included. And basically it supports large disk sizes, but also it allows us to activate a partition on any disk that we can access from the tool. So we're going to go ahead and change to the second drive, which is D, and erase the partition, which is what we're doing here. And then we're going to create a DOS partition, create a primary DOS partition, maximum size available, and then we are going to activate that DOS partition. And now it's active. So then we press escape to continue and escape to continue, and that'll get us back out to the main DOS prompt. And we're going to reboot so that we can format the disk that we just made. And we're going to go back into Prepare Disk, option 1. We're going to use Format. You're going to do /S in order to copy the system files and make the drive bootable. You can pick a label. I just use system. And then now the disk is prepared for boot. And we've got the the reason that we want to do it this way without loading the ASPI layer is the second we load it, we can no longer use fdisk. So now we're going to reboot again. This time you picking option 2 from the automation menu in order to mount the USB disk and transfer and install the files. It's going to boot up and it will detect the USB stick. It's detected the USB stick, and then we are going to switch to the drive, make sure the files are there, and then we'll do an xcopy just like we did on the virtual machine, only we're going to go from the D drive to the C drive in this case. Notice it's going much faster because we're using a much faster version of USB on the Thing client, and we're not using emulation. So once this finishes, you're pretty much done. I hope that this helps some of you. Thought it would be a good way to kind of celebrate this whole idea of DOScember. I think it's great to look back at some of this old stuff, and I think it's really neat that the old operating system like DOS 622 will still load on some of this newer hardware. Particularly on devices that are clearly meant to be crossover devices, like one of these clients that has serial and parallel. When the files are done copying, you can just delete anything that's extra, like the Netboot utilities. So that about wraps it up. Had a whole lot of fun doing this. We've got some other things in the pipe. I made a new joystick interface for my CPM computer that I'm going to start working on getting 2-button joysticks to work with. Ported the Tetris program to a more vanilla version of CPM. Have it loading up in less than, well, probably between 32 and 64K of memory, and I could go even smaller, just kind of debating what I want to do there. So I hope you guys enjoyed this, and thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.